Hello, BookTube. I'm Shawn, the Book Maniac. Welcome back to my channel, and this is going to be a fabulous discussion on a fabulous novel set in Africa, Afterlives by Abdulrazak Gurnah, published. It's his 10th novel and most recent published in 2020. And we three, I'm here joined here by an illustrious mother-daughter duo on BookTube. You decided which one you think is the mother and which one's the daughter, because I think they're just sisters, really. But we've got Tilly in the yellow, and we've got Tilly of Tilly's Shelf, and Roz of Scally About the Books with the lovely shawl on. Hello, ladies.
Hiya.
So Tilly's going to set the scene here for us by telling us a little bit about the Nobel Prize winning author, including why it's really difficult to explain where he's from or all that stuff. Abdulrazak Gurnah. Take it away, Tilly.
Okay, so as we said, we're discussing Afterlives by Abdulrazak Gurnah. And Gurnah was born in what is now Zanzibar in 1948, and moved to the UK, to Britain, in around 1964 when effectively a civil war or revolution broke out on Zanzibar in connection to the departure of colonial powers from the region, and point when a union between what was once German East Africa, then became Tanganyika, a union between that area of mainland and Zanzibar was being put together to create what is now called Tanzania. He moved to the UK and started writing as a way of, from what he says, dealing with the sort of the feelings of displacement and a disconnection, and dealing with kind of having moved to a different place and needing to sort of process that in a way, and had some increasing moderate success with that. Also became a teacher of creative writing at the University of Kent, and lectures on kind of literature related topics. And yeah, has gradually sort of matured in his style to the point of writing a lot of books that do kind of cope with those themes of displacement, and building up towards his work Afterlives. And after writing Afterlives, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in 2021. By all accounts, really quite surprised him, and quite surprised a few people who had expected the Nobel Prize to go to maybe a different East African author or a different author completely. He says that he kind of thought it was a hoax at first, because he was so not expecting that he would be on the radar. So yeah, so that's a little bit.
That's fantastic. Yeah, and it's everybody trips over the fact they say he was born in Tanzania. Well, Tanzania didn't exist, and blah blah blah. And you did a fabulous job. So well done. So this is my first and definitely not my last novel by Abdulrazak Gurnah. Who's read what? I know both of you have read a novel, and I think there might be different ones. So, Roz, what have you read before you read this one?
So I read his book By the Sea, which came out in I think 2001, maybe 2000. I'm pretty sure 2001. And so I read it quite a while back. And Gurnah, I think, writes kind of two types of novel, loosely speaking, thematically. Novels that are set sort of in the sort of historical East Africa colonialism, which is the kind of book that Afterlives is. And then the other type of novel he writes are ones about the displacement, being a migrant or a refugee, or living somewhere, living in Europe, say, and but coming from East Africa. And By the Sea is one of the latter. So it's one of his. So it kind of begins in Gatwick Airport in London.
And did you like that one?
Oh, a lot. Yeah.
Yeah.
This refugee takes a false name for his application, and then he's given someone like a mentor or a translator, and actually that translator turns out to be the son of the person whose name he has taken, and they turn out to be connected. So yeah, it's a good story. Yeah.
I hate when that happens.
And there's a whole kind of back history, so that you get of the two families and conflict. So,
and Tilly, I know you've read a different one, and you have a rather funny story about it. So please tell us.
So I've read Paradise, which was his book in 1994. Before Afterlives, I think it was considered one of his most recognized books. And I read this because he was part of a creative writing teaching online course that I participated in, and they mentioned this book. So I got hold of it and read it on a couple of night shifts, came in from those night shifts and did a very casual, quite sleepy review about things that I liked and didn't like about it. And then a couple of months later, he won the Nobel Prize, and mine was one of the very few videos on YouTube that was about this. So I found out about him winning the Nobel Prize from getting about, 10 notifications all at once being like, how did you know he was going to win the Nobel Prize? And yeah, things of that nature. So yeah, I probably didn't do it justice in that review. So we've got to do Afterlives justice now. And interesting thing about the connection between Paradise and Afterlives is they're both sort of about, I suppose, a coming of age, and they're both set in, as Ros was saying, one of his themes of writing was to have writing that's set on the mainland of East Africa, and they're both set in that location. And Paradise ends at what we can see is likely to be the start of the First World War, which is a very important part of the first section, I would suppose, of Afterlives. So they kind of fit together in terms of giving you a bit of a narrative of that time period of colonial rule, or the impact of colonial rule on that part of East Africa.
Now, I'm going to ask, we're all going to share just in a kind of brief 2 or 3 minute way, our impressions of the book. Did we like it? Why or why not? And then we're just going to get down into the weeds. But before we get into any of that, let's talk about spoilers. This is a book that is almost impossible to talk about in any depth without talking about what happens. So we're going to give you a spoiler wall, and that's going to happen pretty early in this chat. So we are confident that anything we say before I say, okay, now we're getting into spoiler territory, you don't have to worry that it's going to be a spoiler for the book. But most of this video is going to be, we want to talk about what happened. So you're just going to have to decide whether you want to watch it or go away and read the book and come back. And then you want to watch it after that. So editing Shawn here. Well, the way that the discussion unfolded, it didn't go quite like what I just said. We just fell into a rhythm of discussing the major themes of the novel, and while we did refer to several things that had happened and how they touched on the lives of some characters or other characters, we didn't really spoil anything in the way that we talked about those big themes. So the spoiler wall doesn't go up until right around the 30-minute mark. It's very well broadcast that the spoiler wall is going up, and up until then, we talk about the big themes of the novel, and I don't think they're spoilers, but I'll leave it up to you. So yeah, just 2 or 3 minutes on, did you like it? Why or why not? Roz.
Yes, I did like it. I liked it a lot. It's quite a slow burn as a book, I think. You start with a lot of different characters being introduced and a lot of backstory. So I had a little panic that Shawn the Book Maniac, the Empress of bailing, might bail on it because it was so slow to get into. But I was wrong, much to my relief. But yes, it kind of had to, I suppose it has a bit of a prologue where you get a lot of backstory and lots of names, lots of different names. And then it really gets into its stride in the middle, which I absolutely loved. I loved it. It's one of those books where you want to go and look up and understand where they're talking about what's happening, what the history is. And so that was, and that I like that, that's a Rose thing. And then if I had a grumble about the book, it would be the way it ends. And I hope we can talk about that a bit more, but it might have to be after the spoiler wall.
Yeah, we definitely want to talk about, because now you got me all curious. Yeah. Great. And Tilly.
Yeah, I liked this book, but I did struggle with it to an extent. So I started reading it, was full of enthusiasm, read about the first 100 pages, got into the section where it really kind of gets into detail about the war and the impact of the war on that region. For various reasons, was finding it a little bit difficult to read that section about the fighting, but thought, I'm doing really well with this. I'm well ahead of the game on the group read thing. So I stopped, read 12 other books, and then came back to it. So it obviously didn't sort of grip me that powerfully. And I think there is a kind of a pacing thing and a style thing that's not exactly what I expect of a contemporary novel. Mind you, I don't read that many in terms of literary fiction, but I did like it. And I comparing it to Paradise, I think this is quite a big improvement. And I think that his writing has matured a lot, even though Paradise I did think was a well-written book. I think this has got more assurance, more confidence, more grasp of what he's trying to achieve, and he's getting it done in a better way. So yeah, I liked it, but it obviously didn't fully absorb me.
What about you, Shawn?
Yeah, well, I read it alongside dozens of other books, and I'm the slowpoke reader. The reason that when did we start reading this? About 1987 or something. We're finally talking about it, but I was completely absorbed from the first page. My experience of this was, do you remember when Lindy got a concussion? This was before she came onto BookTube, and I read to her for about 6 weeks. I read an hour, pretty much about an hour a day on Voxer, and I read just first papers of books on my shelf or a short story or something. And one of the ones that I previewed that way was the first 10 pages or so of this book, and I read it to Lindy, and we were both really absorbed by it. And so it's always been carrying a torch for it ever since, wanting to get back to it. And so finally I have, because I forget what Tilly said. Something, was it online or on Voxer? You said something about this book, and I said, "Oh, let's read it together." So here we are. In many ways, it doesn't. Now, a book that's slow to get into doesn't me off. Not this kind of a book, because this was just a very slow accumulation of building the narrative and revealing the characters. And I just thought it was masterfully done. I can't think of anything bad actually to say about this. I'm surprised that I liked it as much as I did. I mean, the paragraphs, most of them were at least half a page and maybe a page and a half. And sometimes that turns me off. It didn't turn me off with this. I just found it really easy to read on the level of prose and so on, and very difficult material, because I don't think I even knew that there was such a thing as German East Africa. I didn't know anything about Tanzania. I knew the name, but I didn't know anything about its history. And those details are an important part of the story. And like Roz said, I Google read the crap out of this, and I love that. I love Google reading, and so I got this education about German East Africa. But if that's all it was, that would just be a nonfiction book. I loved the characters, or I loved the depth at which the characters were revealed. I think I would say it was a character-driven novel, even though there was so much that happened. I loved the slowness of it. I loved this book. It was an eye-opener. I'm so glad that I read it. So now, who wants to get us started to tiptoe down into the weeds?
I was just thinking about what you were saying about it being absorbing and the style of it and so on. I think there's something to mention about the style in terms of, it's quite interesting how he covers quite a large time period at a broad brush, and then he focuses in really precisely on one or two scenes, like a couple of things that happen, and then we kind of zoom back out and we might pass a few months just described really lightly and quite eloquently before we zoom in on something that could happen quite a long time later or with different characters. And yeah, I found that quite an interesting kind of in and out phasing. But I don't know how you two.
That's a great way to describe it. Yeah.
Yeah. Because the book as a whole covers about 70 or 80 years, I think. But there's certain periods that, we get in vivid Technicolor detail, and others, as you say, that are kind of whisked through much faster. It was the detail that I was probably one of the things that I loved most about the book. Did you notice how whenever you went into a home or a building, he'd give you this really detailed description of where the rooms were and how they interconnected and what they were made of and what they were used for. And, it was very immersive in that sense, because, you could really picture, and that really bedded the people into the place, I think.
I think that was important in terms of describing where people sleep in a house, for instance. You see certain characters, and I won't name them, but just you see certain characters coming from maybe sleeping in the corridor, sleeping by the door, or even sleeping outside, and having a very low status, to then later in the book moving through the rooms of the house as they get to a place where they're more stable, they're more secure, or they have a bit more recognition as a character, or more status in the family. So those details kind of feed into then telling you something about the people in the house.
One of the things that to me was most important about this book is the danger in a colonial, and I don't want to generalize too much, but the danger in this colonial environment of learning how to read and write. That was something that linked so many of the characters. So anybody want to riff on that, or shall I?
It's a danger, but it's also an opportunity. And we can see how they're put at risk through this, but then later stages, they then are able to take on new jobs or new roles. One of the things I loved was one of the characters was able to leave the house for the first time later in the book because she was able to read and write and had been hiding that or suppressing that for years.
I mean, yes, I thought, in a way, I didn't think of it as a danger of being able to read and write. I thought it was about the power of being able to read and write, and that might sometimes get you into trouble. But
yes, absolutely. Thank you for refining my point, because that's really what I meant to say. Yes. It's particularly dangerous for women.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the main characters is Afia, and she learns to read and write, and she gets beaten by her quote unquote uncle for it and maimed for life because he thinks that's, she's going to become a prostitute or something. She's only about 7 years old or something, 8 years old. Whereas the men, they fare better. They get jobs in the colonial structure if they can read and write the colonial language.
But there is a kind of mirroring between Afia getting a permanent impairment from being beaten for being able to read and write, and Hamza, who's another one of the characters who learns to read and write in German, in the colonial language, and his ability to do that leads to some tension with the Germans, and he ends up being beaten, arguably as a result of the learning that he had. So I like that those characters kind of complemented each other in that way. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely.
So you're absolutely right, Tilly, that Hamza ends up being attacked partly because of that, but yet also surviving what happens to him, it is also down to the fact that he's literate, and the German officer that he's connected with, who spends time teaching him German. I mean, that's a really interesting relationship because he's sort of pulled in two ways, isn't he? The German officer and Hamza, they have a connection over literature, and yet there's also a degree of sort of scorn and tension in that relationship. I thought was one of the most interesting and complex relationships in the book, and you could say is a bit of a metaphor for the colonial relationship.
Absolutely. The first character we meet is Khalifa. It's quite a lovely description of him getting tutoring in this little dark room from a tutor, and just how overjoyed he is to learn not math, but especially English. And that gets him into the place where he becomes a central character in the story, because he gets jobs and employment because he knows the language. So that was kind of set the tone from there. Yeah.
No.
Perhaps it's worth saying, just as a context of the story, like Khalifa's almost the central character, but not the main character. And there are a collection of characters that he knows all of, and he is the focal point to in terms of their interactions as the timeline goes on.
Another thing that I really found rich and satisfying, I suppose, about this book was, I think that, I don't know about in Canada, Shawn, but in the UK, there's an obsession with teaching the history of World War One and World War Two. Like everyone learns it at school several times over, it seems. You sometimes wonder if there's any other period. It's the Romans and World War One and World War Two is all you get. But nevertheless, despite that obsession, you never, ever get to hear that both wars also happened in Africa. Maybe like North Africa, the sort of comes into the, World War II. But the fact that there was a whole chunk of World War One was happening in East Africa is just doesn't feature, and I think that must be something that Gurnah feels quite strongly about, and so that's why he puts it into his novels.
Yeah, it's something that I was absolutely definitely going to mention. Like, we have this completely Eurocentric teaching of World War One, for instance, where it's just trenches, trenches, trenches. And I think I'd recommend this book to a wide range of people, but I think if you're somebody that's studying history or like spending a lot of time on history, and like this book will just kind of open your eyes to a huge extra portion of that conflict. But it's really interesting how even from page one, even from the bit that's set long before the start of the First World War, we get this association between colonial powers and war. And you get this, and then there was this uprising, which the Europeans were putting down. And then there was this uprising, and they were brutal in putting it down. And this kind of cyclical thing where you get this impression that the people who are trying to control it are just locked into this perpetual cycle of fighting. It just escalates to the point of the war, rather than the war being something that came out of nowhere.
Like, absolutely, the kind of almost like the beginning of the book, there's almost like a prologue of around the sort of older history of that sort of part of East Africa. And another thing that we don't hear about is the extent to which, though, the people in the countries who were colonized, how much resistance there was. In fact, and all around Africa, that most places there was vigorous resistance, and that's sort of again almost written out of history a lot of the time, or we don't learn about it.
And then on the other side of that, another thing that I think is a major strand of the story is the colonized overly identify and are loyal to the colonizers. And that's a huge thing in this story.
Yeah.
Especially the character of Ilias. I get his and Hamza's story. What happened? What is his early story? Is he kidnapped? No.
Yes. Yeah, he's the one that's kidnapped. Hamza's the one that was a debt slave.
So neither one of them, they started out pretty poorly in life. And he gets I think apprenticed to a German on a plantation or something.
Yeah.
And then he just identifies, his whole identity is tied up with the German colonial structure. And so that's what gets him into World War One. He doesn't question it. He just goes and enlists. And that it's not a spoiler to say that, but that plays out and affects the course of the events for most of the other characters in the rest of the novel. Whereas Hamza, he's kind of pressured into being an Askari, which is the African contingent of the military, the Schutztruppe Askari, if I pronounced that right. I'm sure I didn't. And then he seems kind of unaffected by it. He doesn't seem to have loyalty to anything political himself, but he certainly goes through the war. But it's a pretty big deal.
I was thinking about what Tilly said earlier, or you, about characters sort of mirroring each other. I think that you get that mirroring between Ilias, who in a way almost like adopts the idea of the sort of German civilizing mission and, a loyalty to the German sort of colonial authority. And the flip side is the German officer, who Hamza is closely connected to, who what you see in him is he's completely conflicted, isn't he, about the Germans' role. And, he's there as a German army officer, fighting for German control of this. But he has huge doubts, doesn't he? And I thought that was quite subtly done by Gurnah.
Absolutely.
What, what I thought was the interesting kind of difference between Ilyas and Hamza is kind of on the subject of religion, because Ilyas, like you mentioned, he's brought in by a German kind of establishment when he's very young, and brought up essentially as a Christian. And there's a few references in the later stages where he goes back, moves away from a more German influenced area to an area where people are largely Muslim, and he's kind of having to learn how to pray or pretend that he knows how to pray, and kind of saying, "Oh no, you lead, I'll follow you," and kind of disguise that part of. And he is kind of confused about that faith, whereas Hamza, although he spends years working with these Christian German officers, is presented as being maybe not very religious, but very culturally Muslim, in that he goes to prayer very regularly, even though it says, he's more doing it kind of for the social aspect, or because he likes being in the mosque rather than because he likes the prayer itself. But yeah, that difference between the two of them in terms of the age, I suppose the age at which they first experienced that kind of influence over them. I don't know.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
We've been talking about the rich detail about the history of that part of East Africa that Gurnah puts in the book, and how much we enjoyed that, and how important it seemed to be to him to include it in the book. Did you feel that he was actually trying to pack in too much of that? Did you ever feel that the character-driven story suffered because he was anxious to include enough detail about the historical events and the historical story?
No, not at all.
I agree with Shawn. No, I felt like he included what he needed to include. I also did a little bit of internet research on certain points, but I think that's my lack of pre-existing knowledge rather than him. If he had all of that in, then there might have been less Google, but a more boring read.
My feeling about it is that he felt it was important to have that as a counterbalance to the fact that, other than Ilyas, the older, the senior, these characters were pretty apolitical. So we didn't hear them espousing any political opinions. They weren't supporting the rebels. Other than Ilyas Senior, they didn't is in support of the war or against the war in particular. They were just everyday people, and I think that was I actually have a question for you: whether the characters in the other novels by Gurnah that you read, was it kind of like that? Were they not so politically situated? Because I love that about this book, and I felt that the counterpoint of the history and the politics made it all work together very well.
I would say what's interesting in Paradise, the main character in this is Yusuf, and Yusuf definitely says some things that could be a bit political or a bit controversial, particularly on the topic of freedom. He's effectively enslaved and kind of talks at stages about kind of wanting to regain his freedom. But the colonial side of the politics feels completely detached. And you get this sense that at that time, he and some of the other characters kind of see them as the colonizers, as people who are kind of coming around doing some random stuff, and without really perceiving it as a political event, and kind of seeing it as detached from their reality and their life and their trade systems and their culture, and not kind of really interpreting the intent behind those colonizers being present. So they don't kind of interact with the politics in that sense.
What about in the novel that you read, Ross?
Yeah, I mean, I think because it's set much more in a much more modern time period and set in the UK, but then looking back to events in Tanzania, it has quite a different flavour. So, yeah, I wouldn't make a straight kind of comparison. I think in this one, what you do, you get this really strong sense of how, yes, people are just trying to get on with their lives, and big events happen around them, and sometimes they're sort of pawns in that and caught up in it. But like, say, for some people, what was most important about what was the war or whatever, and the Second World War was how it affected their trade, or their imports and exports and what they could make. So actually, that feeling of actually day-to-day life just goes on, except that every now and then you find you can't sell anything or you haven't got any food because there's these big people doing other stuff, out the side.
I think although our discussion has kind of talked about the colonial, because it definitely overshadows the whole book, but that relationship that Hamza has with the German officer and one other German character that he interacts with after that, they're the only real German characters that play a major role. This book is about the people who were affected by the colonial wars and the colonial system, but it's not about that. It's about them. There's very little visible presence of the colonizer in the book.
And so many of the holes in their lives, in their personal lives, are a direct result of the colonial society that they live in and the colonial wars that they live through. I'm going to put up the spoiler wall now, even though I think we're probably almost done, but there's a couple things at least. Roz tantalized the heck out of me by saying something about the ending, so I want to hear her thoughts on that. And then, so the spoiler wall's up, people. If you don't want to hear things about the end or anything that's got spoilery, just go away. Just go read the book and come back. Here, I'm dying to ask you this question because I may have missed something, or whatever. But what did you make of Ilias, the younger? So that's Hamza and Afia's boy, and he starts doing voices and talking to himself, and they're worried about that because the main voice he's doing is of a plaintive woman calling for Ilias, which is his maternal uncle who he never met, and so he's kind of absorbed his mother's grief about what happened to Ilias. But when the witch, what would you call her, the spiritual healer, comes and does her thing with all the drummers and stuff, I loved the description of all that. That was so fascinating. Her diagnosis, her verdict is that, if I read it correctly, is that the voice inside of Ilias is actually of his quote unquote grandmother, Biasha, because she died about 3 days after he was born. And that Biasha was mourning and yearning for Ilias. And that sounded to me like there was a secret. She harbored a secret love for her husband's friend. Did I miss something in there?
Oh,
Can't remember. I possibly, because
they were just friends.
one...
He was just her friend's husband. And I don't remember any of their interactions earlier in the novel, but it was B. Asha that's whose voice had been swallowed by the kid. That it was B. Asha yearning for Ilias, and that caught me by surprise. But maybe I misinterpreted it. I'm really dying to hear what's going on in that big brain of Roz's right now because I can hear the wheels turning.
No, yeah, I'm trying to make sense of that, and I didn't see it like that. Biasha has like this. I thought like she has quite a close relationship with Afia, a kind of a complex relationship, doesn't she? So I thought that it was her expressing what she thought was on Afia's mind and was distressing her.
Well, that's a very simple explanation. Mine's more dramatic, so that's the one I went for. But yours is probably
why not?
I just quickly scanned back, and it doesn't really look like there's any scenes of interaction between Biasha and Ilias. It kind of goes from Ilias and Khalifa being friends to Ilias leaving again.
I think it was just the way that spiritual healer worded it when she explained it to Hamza after. And I'm not going to take the time to look it up, but it's like, there's some romantic or sexual yearning in this. So maybe not. I read sex into everything, so we'll just move on.
Okay.
I mean, you do get the sense that Biasha is not sexually or emotionally fulfilled in her relationship to Khalifa. Like, there's definitely she has something lacking throughout her whole life that they never.
It was basically an arranged marriage. Yeah. Although I think they seemed to get along fine in the early days, but yeah, she had some issues with. life. I wouldn't
Yeah.
want to cross her.
And
No.
she also had to have a spiritual healer come to see her, didn't she? So the two characters in the novel that have to have the spiritual healer come to them are Biasha and then Ilias, who seems to be implied possessed by Biasha. So kind of like
Yes.
her emotions, her emotional
yes.
instability kind of feeds into him.
Mm.
Which I guess it's maybe something about sort of intergenerational trauma, or that the stress and distress that's come from the earlier eras is still being lived by the younger Ilias, even though he's born in an era that is much more stable. Maybe not perfectly stable, but more stable than the First and Second World War.
That's a very important part of it. I'm just
Yeah.
going to barge in again and say, Roz, what were you saying about the ending? What, something you didn't like, or
Well, just for me, there was a really strange change of pace. It's like the book fell into three parts, and the prologue bit worked well for me, you know, and all the background. Then you get the more detailed chunks in the middle, and all the, you know, the war bit, you know, that was great. And then it's almost like an epilogue, isn't it? And I felt like he was almost trying to tie up too many things and bring too many elements in, and suddenly we have the younger Ilyas marching around Germany, visiting
solving the
archives and
mystery?
so on, and solving the mystery. For me, as an ending, you know, it brought an interesting new perspective to the history and the story. It felt a bit tacked on or underdeveloped. Like almost I needed another 100 pages to do it justice. So you didn't feel like that.
I didn't feel that way at all, but I can see that as being a very valid, valid but wrong opinion, Ross.
For me, it worked really well, and yes, a valid but wrong opinion. I agree. For me, it works really well because I think if you look back to a lot of the characters that Hamza interacts with during the war phase, they would never have envisaged a future in which Hamza's child moves to Germany, has success in Germany, like is an academic and able to trace family connections. Like that wasn't the Germany that they were fighting for, and I think it provides a really nice kind of flip point of how they were trying to sort of take control of an aspect of history, but couldn't, and they had no idea what the future ripples of their actions were going to be, both in the Germany, East Africa, and in the wider world. So I don't know. For me, I was like, I liked how it showed the sort of the unintended ramifications of the events earlier in the book, that it kind of told that whole historical story.
And this thought just occurred to me as I was listening to you two talk about this, that it also important kind of vibration between the two Iliases in Germany. I mean, Ilias the Younger is excavating the story of Ilias the Senior in Germany, but there's a really profound resonance between their experiences in Germany. And the other reason why it was effective for me is because the fate of Ilias the Senior was so baked into Ilias Junior's psyche that it just made it perfect sense that it would be him that would go to find stuff out, because it would probably come some kind of a psychological spiritual shift in him. Okay, so the last line, it's not a spoiler to read it, and we're already in spoiler territory, but I thought it was a really powerful last line and kind of a scariest one. So with no context, it's at the end of the story as Ilias the Younger is come back to tell his parents what he found out, and he says, "So what we can know for sure," Ilias told his parents, "is that someone loved Uncle Ilias enough to follow him to certain death in a concentration camp in order to keep him company." Very enigmatic last line of the novel. And we don't need to sketch in all the details of what he's talking about, but just what did you make of that?
Oh, interesting.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think one of the key themes of the book is about humanity and how we treat each other. And so it's a fitting ending in that sense.
Yeah, it's about human kindness and love.
Yeah.
I watched an interview today with Gurnah, interviewed by Maza Mengisti, and she asked him at near the end of it, what do you think readers should take away? Which I think is kind of a terrible question to ask, but anyway, and he said, well, if I had to only name one thing, I would say human warmth and kindness. I think I'm so that last line certainly speaks to that, but I thought it was just it's the kind of last line of a novel that, I'll long remember.
Yeah. And I think it's about, obviously Ilias the Older is somebody who we see as being ripped away from his family on multiple occasions and being dislocated and disjointed, and probably not realizing that his little sister that he knew for such a short period of time, that she misses him that much, that she cares about him that much, that she wants to know what's happened to him. He probably has no concept of that. So it's just a nice kind of word to say, although he had those difficult experiences at the beginning of his life, at the end of his life, he did experience love and family and bonds and connections that he hadn't had up to that point.
Yes. And wasn't it unforgivable that he took his little sister back to those terrible people to go off to the war? What the hell?
Yeah, I didn't like that as an action from his character.
Yeah. I think it's probably obvious, but knowing me, I missed the deeper part of it. So what do you make of the title? Afterlives.
I think it's about the trauma that they all go through, and for all of these characters, it's the life that they build after the difficult stuff that happens to them. So Afterlives, it's at points that they might not have survived. It's almost like the afterlife that they're granted after going through that challenging circumstance. Although I'm sure there's other interpretations possible, but that's how I saw it.
Great. Roz, do you have anything to add?
I think Tilly's put it really well. I mean, it had resonance for me of aftermath as well.
Mm-hmm.
So, so that the aftermath of colonialism, the aftermath of war, the aftermath of all their individual experiences. But yeah, no, you put it beautifully, Tilly.
I was also thinking potentially, I mean, like this, I keep drawing connections between them, but like in Paradise and Afterlife are both kind of different words for heaven, or different religious words that and although like what happens in Afterlife is definitely not a presentation of heaven, it's I think there was a link there.
Well, speaking of heaven, it's been heavenly to have this chat with you two erudite people. So I think we've sold a whole bunch of people that are going to rush out and buy it and read it. Hopefully, read it too. And who knows? Maybe we'll come together and do another Abdulrazak Gurnah novel. I'm not going to commit to doing it next year, but in the future. So
I'd be happy to. Yeah.
Yeah. It's been a great chat. Thank you so much, and thank you for watching.
Yeah. Thank you so much for arranging the Buddy Reach one.